Welcome to this episode of the Think Wildlife podcast. Today I speak to Matthew Shirley, who is a research assistant professor at the Florida International University. He is also the chair of the IUCN Pangolin Specialist Group. Also known as scaly anteaters, the pangolin is the most illegally wildlife traded mammal in the world. There are 8 species of mammals, 4 of which are found in Africa and 4 of which are found in Asia. We talk in depth about the conservation of pangolins across these two continents and what can be done to tackle their illegal wildlife trade. We also talk about the association of pangolins to the COVID-19 pandemic. Matthew has also worked extensively on the conservation of various crocodile species in Central and Western Africa. We talk about his work in this region as well. Tune in to listen more, and I hope you enjoy the podcast. And don't forget to share and subscribe. So, welcome, Matt, to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on here today.
Thanks, Anish. It's nice to be here.
What got you interested in studying pangolins and crocodiles?
Yeah, so when I was a kid, I was always very interested in reptiles more than any other kind of group of taxa. And I think I caught my very first snake at a relatively young age, maybe 9 or 8 even. And since then, I was just kind of addicted. And as I started learning more and more about the wide world of reptiles, in particular, crocodiles just always caught my fancy. They're very interesting ecologically. They're these really kind of very adept predators, and they're people kind of call them quote unquote perfect for their ecological role. And they have lots of issues with them. They're wrought with conflict against people, but people kind of hunt them and use them, and then people of course admire them, and they're really quite interesting. And then so I started my career on crocodiles, working in West and Central Africa, and as a giant wildlife nerd, I think this tendency to admire wildlife was really kind of instilled in me and my parents at a young age. So, instead of putting me down in front of your typical cartoons and whatever on the TV, my parents would plot me down in front of nature shows. And I grew up watching Jacques Cousteau, for example, and that's what really got me hooked on wildlife. And so when I started working in Africa on crocodiles, I always had a knowledge of, general natural history and other species that could be found where I was. And of course, pangolins just stand out as such a bizarre group of animals in the world, and I always wanted to see one, but they're very difficult to find in the wild. So despite spending years and years in pangolin habitat, it actually took me about 15 years before I saw my first wild pangolin, and from that moment on, I was just kind of hooked. You got this weird scaly mammal like kind of scurrying through the forest and inchworming its way up trees, and yeah, they're cute and crazy and bizarre and weird, and yeah, I just kind of fell in love from the first moment. And I kind of, a couple of years before that first sighting, had decided that I really wanted to start working on pangolins. But from that first sighting onwards, it was kind of inevitable.
How many species of pangolins are there and where are they found across the world?
Yeah, so right now we currently recognize 8 species of pangolin. There are 4 species that are endemic to Africa, and 4 species that are endemic to Asia. And within Africa, the vast majority of pangolin diversity is in West and Central Africa, where we have 3 species. 2 of those species barely extend into parts of East or Southern Africa, and then East and Southern Africa is largely one species. And so that's the Temminck's ground pangolin, and then the West and Central African species are white-bellied pangolin, black-bellied pangolin, and giant pangolin. And then in Asia, we have 4 species again. 2 of them, one of them, I should say, is fairly widely distributed. The Sunda pangolin kind of occurs throughout Southeast Asia, including into the islands in Indonesia and Malaysia. And then Philippine pangolin is endemic to island of Palawan in the Philippines. And then Indian pangolin is largely distributed throughout South Asia, so India and Pakistan into Nepal and Bangladesh. And then the Chinese pangolin kind of occurs around the distribution of Sunda and Indian pangolin, largely in China, and then into Nepal and Bangladesh as well. And so it's there's 4 species recognized currently, but there's also been a lot of research lately that shows that within these species, because they each have fairly wide distributions that encompass some fairly significant landscape features, like across mountains or across major rivers or whatever, which we don't really understand yet how these landscape features impact gene flow in pangolins, that But we do understand that there's a lot of cryptic diversity out there. And so, for example, eight or so years ago now, there was a nice research paper on white-bellied pangolins that was able to sample across its distribution and found that there was really significant genetic divergence across the distribution, as many as 6 or 7 lineages, in fact. And then just this year, a few weeks ago, a new paper came out highlighting the discovery of what's being called a fifth unknown Asian species. And we call it unknown because the only evidence we have for it is the genomes of 6 scales that were pulled out of bags of confiscated scales. And so we don't have a whole specimen. We don't know where it's found in the wild. We know nothing about it aside from the fact that these 6 scales, amongst the millions of scales in this seizure, contained a genome that was radically divergent from everything else that we know to date. So it's a really exciting time to be doing pangolin science and kind of understanding their evolution and their diversity.
Pangolins are the most trafficked species in the world. Why is this the case?
Yeah, so we characterize pangolins as the most trafficked wild mammals in the world because for the past, well, at least the past 10 years, we have significant evidence of, well, we have significant confiscations, let's say. It's around 300 tons of scales. So 300 metric tons of just scales or more have been seized as illegal shipments from one country to another to kind of fuel this trade in scales and other body parts for traditional medicinal purposes. But before that, even going back into the 70s and 80s, there's less documentation, but significant anecdotal evidence that the same volumes, and actually perhaps even more higher volumes of both scales and pangolin carcasses, as like frozen meat, for example, were traded between different countries in the world to kind of fuel this demand for pangolin meat as a luxury kind of consumption, as a luxury meat good, and scales as a traditional medicinal ingredient. And if you kind of look around the world in pangolin range states, and it's not every pangolin range state because different range states have different cultural affiliations to eating wild meat or using products from wild animals or wild plants in their traditional cultural uses. But there's a long tradition of consuming pangolins. The meat is said to be very highly desired amongst the potential wild meat offerings throughout West and Central Africa, for example. And that's the same in Southeast Asia. So in particular in Vietnam, pangolin meat is really highly desired. And then for medicinal purposes, there's hundreds of body parts that are used for different purposes around the world. In places like China, for example, it's predominantly the scales, which are dried and grounded into a powder and used to make kind of infusions, like a tea infusion or something, among other purposes. Whereas in West and Central Africa, many more body parts have been used to treat different ailments. Ranging from things like problematic pregnancies, premature bleeding, erectile dysfunction, skin disease, whatever it happens to be. And so they have a really important place in the lore and culture of the local peoples almost anywhere that they're found in the world. And so that demand kind of continues today. The dynamics and the intricacies, the nuance of that demand and the nuance of the species that are in high demand, of course, has evolved. And so, for example, the traditional Chinese pharmacopoeia, when it started including pangolins, which actually is not that long ago, all things considered, in the traditional Chinese pharmacopoeia, it really only made reference to the Chinese pangolin. But as China has developed and the human population has evolved there, and the environment has become increasingly degraded, and Chinese pangolins were increasingly over prosecuted, Chinese pangolins became less and less available, and so the practical pharmacopoeia, if not the documented pharmacopoeia, extended to include basically any pangolin. And so there were huge numbers of shipments of pangolins from Malaysia and Indonesia. These are Sunda pangolins, for example, to feed that demand in China. But then gradually, as the environment environments in those places became more and more degraded, and the populations of pangolins decreased. And of course, with different Chinese and global initiatives like their Belts and Railways initiative out in the world, where China is actively contributing to the development of countries throughout the global South, in Africa and South America, for example. With the expansion of Chinese citizens in those countries, the accessibility of pangolins, of different pangolin species, in particular from Africa, increased. And so the African pangolins kind of stepped in to fill that void left behind by Chinese pangolins, and eventually all Asian pangolins. And so, that demand continues today. Their legal use in some places continues today. And really, all of this is underpinned, like it is for most species, by massive global habitat change and habitat loss. And pangolins are very interesting in that we kind of, we have a lot of evidence to suggest that pangolins can, in fact, thrive in altered and secondary landscapes, such as either degraded forests or even agricultural plantations, like extensive palm oil plantations, for example. But and the reason that we think that is because those habitats actually really facilitate an extensive ant and termite diversity, and ants and termites are pangolins' preferred or really almost exclusive food source. And so pangolins are really quite adaptable in that way to habitat change. But then, of course, the problem is if you're talking about degraded secondary forests or plantations, I mean, that's where people are. That's where people are conducting their activities, and people, of course, are harvesting those agricultural products. And so when they find a pangolin, instead of leaving it alone, they just harvest it. And so it's kind of a catch-22. It's it might be a better habitat or an equally suitable habitat for pangolins, but it puts them in more accessible range of people, and so those populations get harvested quite heavily. And it's really kind of a complicated and intricate situation at the end of the day.
Pangolins are often blamed for the COVID-19 pandemic. Why is this the case, and what is the latest scientific evidence around this?
Yeah, so when the COVID-19 pandemic started happening, scientists, virologists around the world, one of their first things that they did was look at the genome of the virus itself, and then search for other viruses that have very similar genomes. And just by chance, some prior work had been done on beta coronaviruses in pangolins and bats and a bunch of other species. And so we already had some sort of references. And so what they originally found was that the coronaviruses that are found naturally in pangolins, and coronaviruses are found naturally in lots of species, were genetically quite similar to the coronavirus that is now rampant in humans. And off the top of my head, I think the original numbers were something like 92 or 93% similarity. That might have changed by now with some more research, but that degree of similarity is enough where a few chance mutations and it can jump hosts very easily. But for reference, the coronaviruses that are naturally found in bats had a much higher similarity, like 96 or 97 or 98%. And so, on the basis of these similarities, and the fact that pangolins are very heavily consumed in China, and the very high suspicion that the virus kind of emerged out of the Wuhan wet market, which is where wild meat products, including fish and everything else, are available for sale. There was a lot of suspicion that pangolins might have been an intermediary or a direct host to the virus that eventually evolved and came into people. Since that time, there's been a lot more work on it. And, for example, there's no evidence that there was actually any pangolin carcasses in the Wuhan wet market, even if there, and there's increasing suspicion as to whether that, the wet market itself was the source of the virus. And so I think the latest thinking is that pangolins are not directly implicated in the virus as we know it in humans today. But I think it's always nice to keep these hypotheses alive until we kind of come up with more definitive or conclusive evidence, if that's even possible. But fortunately, the latest thinking is that pangolins are really not to blame for this.
So you're the chair of the IUCN Pangolin Specialist Group. So talk about the work being done by this group.
Yeah, so the IUCN SSC Pangolin Specialist Group is one of a couple hundred specialist groups within the Species Survival Commission of the IUCN, which of course is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And specialist groups in the SSC, their job is to effectively unite experts or specialists on the species or thematic that is the subject of the specialist group. And so when I say species, this can be pangolins. There's a crocodile specialist group, there's an Asian elephant specialist group, there's a big cat specialist group, and then of course the thematic, there's specialist groups that focus on kind of conservation strategies like conservation planning or conservation translocations, which is the same as reintroductions. Human wildlife conflict and coexistence, for example, is a very brand new specialist group. And so what our principal job is to find all of the people in the world that are working directly on pangolins themselves. These might be scientists working on pangolin biology or genetics or ecology, or they might be conservationists who are actively working to put in place pangolin specific or pangolin focused conservation strategies. But also in the case of pangolins, because pangolins are very implicated in wildlife trafficking and things like this, we also have members who are very focused on wildlife trafficking, but not specifically on pangolins. But because pangolins feature prominently, there's a very large overlap in their expertise. And we kind of unite them in a network, like a volunteer network, who try to use the best evidence available. So this is like scientific publications or other data they might have, or their vast experience to provide the best guidance that we can to the governments of the world and other stakeholders like NGOs working in pangolin range states on how to approach pangolin conservation in the broadest sense. And so, one of the, as specialist groups, we're really kind of, let's say, beholden to the IUCN species conservation cycle, which is effectively to assess. And so this, relies very heavily on the IUCN Red List, which is the global barometer that is used to basically measure how threatened the world's biodiversity is. And so each species is kind of assessed against population dynamics. So whether the populations are going up or down, and we decide whether on those basis, whether they are endangered species, critically endangered species, or vulnerable species, for example. And so across the pangolins, across 8 species, we have 3 that are critically endangered, 3 that are 3 that are critically injured, 3 that are endangered, and 2 that are vulnerable currently, which kind of speaks to their population change, so a decrease in populations over the past 20 some odd years to date. And then on the basis of that information, we pull our members together to create pangolin conservation action plans. So planning is the second phase of the cycle. And so, in the past 10 years, the Pangolin Specialist Group has worked with stakeholders in Southeast Asia and parts of China, for example, to develop national or regional action plans for the Sunda pangolin, for very specific places in the Chinese pangolin distribution and the Philippine pangolin. And now we're really focusing very heavily on developing action plans for African species. And so earlier this year, we had a big workshop that brought together almost 100 stakeholders from throughout West Africa to develop the very first regional action plan for pangolins, and that corresponds to the West Africa region. And we're in the process of supporting the same in South Africa. Kenya, as a country, just developed their national action plan, and the Pangolin Specialist Group is very heavily involved in helping advise and peer review that process. And then the final step is, of course, assess, plan, act. So act, this is where we're implementing the advised or the recommended actions for pangolins. And so sometimes these come directly from the action plans themselves, and other times we will develop very specific guidance on how to act. And so, for example, one of the predominant conservation interventions for pangolins these days has been rescuing pangolins from live trade situations. So these would be live pangolins found in bushmeat markets or on their way to bushmeat markets or something to that effect, where they're intercepted by law enforcement authorities, confiscated, and brought into a captive rehabilitation situation. And so the Pangolin Specialist Group was able to devise or write a manual effectively for first responders. So let's say you're a police officer that comes across a wild pangolin that's being held by somebody, you confiscate it because it's a protected species. What do you do for the first 1 to 7 days that you're in possession of this animal to ensure that it stays alive and can get to more specialized care? And then from that point in time, then the rehabbers take over. They get the species back to a condition where it can be released in the wild. And then now we're working on guidance on how to select where to reintroduce these species, these individuals back into the wild, for example. And so this is really the work of the Pangolin Specialist Group is looking across species, across cultures, across contexts, and offering the best guidance on how people can act in the benefit of pangolin conservation.
Talk about some of the other work you are involved in regarding
pangolin conservation?
Yeah, so my work with pangolins is a bit diverse. On the one hand, I'm doing in West Africa in some very specific locations. We're looking at pangolin ecology. So how do species like the black-bellied and the white-bellied pangolin react to their environment and react to people in their environment? And so this is things like, we put transmitters on pangolins to see, their home range and be able to determine their habitat use and resource selection. With a really big project now that we're calling Operation Pangolin, we're tackling some of the major problems with pangolin conservation today, or let's say barriers to pangolin conservation today, which is how do we better detect and monitor pangolins in the wild so that we can actually have an understanding of how pangolin populations are reacting to environmental change, for example. And so as part of Operation Pangolin, we're working with Cameroonian and Gabonese stakeholders, including the governments in both of those countries, and we're developing technology. Let's say we're either developing or repurposing technologies that we think might be better adapted at detecting pangolins. And so, pangolins are very hard to find in the wild for scientists for some reason. And so we're hoping that, new types of camera traps relying on thermal technology or audio monitors or, different types of environmental DNA. So pulling DNA from water or pulling DNA from insects like mosquitoes or tsetse flies, might help us better detect pangolins and figure out what they're doing in the wild, which is actually very, very exciting. And then, of course, I'm doing a lot of stuff that has to do with better understanding the trade of pangolins. So as part of Operation Pangolin, one of the things that we're really trying to figure out is a very fine scale resolution of trade and trafficking pathways for pangolins. And so going all the way to the forest from where that pangolin is plucked from the wild, what are the exact roads and highways and villages that this pangolin will pass through in Cameroon, for example, before it makes it to a port city where it's eventually regrouped with, pangolin scale specimens from all over West Africa, and then eventually shipped to either China or, Vietnam or some other country that has a high demand for these scales. And when it is shipped, is it done by sea? And if it's done by sea, what is the exact, pathway the barge follows, the tanker, the transport vessel follows across the world? And then on that same better understanding trade aspect, we mentioned a moment ago that there have been 300 plus tons of pangolin scales seized over the past 10 years. Well, the only thing we know about these scales is effectively where they were seized and maybe where they came from. So if you look at the bill of lading or the transportation pathway of the vessel that they were transported on, we know kind of where they came from. But we've had a hard time to date really understanding the impact that this volume of scales has had on wild populations. And so one of the first steps in doing that is better estimating how many animals, like how many individual pangolins were pulled out of the wild to make a shipment of, let's say, 10 metric tons of scales. And what we're finding is that answer really varies widely from species to species. And so for something like the white-bellied pangolin, 10 tons of scales is going to be, hold on, let me just do a quick math for you so I get this number right. I always get it backwards. But, 10 tons of scales might be something like 50,000 pangolins, right, pulled out of the wild. Whereas for a giant pangolin or something as big as an Indian pangolin or a ground pangolin, that might only be 2,000 or 3,000 pangolins. And so the impact that this trade is having on those species is really quite different. And then so until we really understand that impact, it's very difficult for us to recommend very specific management strategies, which might vary from species to species. And so we're hoping that all this work, which is done always in collaboration with the local governments, with the various members of the Pangolin Specialist Group that are residing in some of these countries, supporting the local students or local conservationists and building their capacity to implement the appropriate research or use the technologies. We're hoping that this eventually is able to really make an impact for pangolin conservation around the world.
How do you think pangolin conservation can be further improved?
Yeah. So what's really interesting about pangolins is, if you kind of consider pangolins as one, looking across the 8 species, and as we talked about earlier, pangolins are really quite able to exist across most of the landscape, which means that, even if they do have some very specific habitat requirements or some very specific food requirements, oftentimes they can move through habitats that aren't really essential for them as they look for habitat patches that are essential for them, or their critical habitat patches kind of exist more broadly and alongside people. And so what this really means is that local communities in particular, so rural communities, local communities, and indigenous communities of people really have a very significant role to play, not only because they're living side by side with pangolins, but because these are also the people that are predominantly either extracting pangolins for sale to a much more urban market, or they are consuming pangolins directly themselves. And so really, I think cooperating or finding ways to cooperate with and incentivize people in these kind of community situations to better protect the pangolin resource is going to be very critical. And in some cases, that means, working with them to find alternatives to their pangolin demands. And so, for traditional medicine, there's lots of evidence to suggest that most wildlife products can be replaced by either a different wildlife product that is not in threat, or by a synthetic product to achieve the desired medicinal effect. And in other cases, it might mean, hands off entirely, or in other cases, it might mean how do people use pangolins in a more sustainable way. So instead of harvesting every pangolin they come across, they harvest a very limited number, for example. And so it requires a lot of creative thinking and really doing the difficult work of going and speaking with these stakeholders, forming a very trusting relationship, and working with them to build like a really sustainable management program together. And that's work that's just now kind of starting with pangolins, and we're hoping that it kind of continues, because for a lot of us, we think that is the only way forward.
You were a part of a paper which studied the ecological importance of crocodiles. So, could you just talk a bit about this?
Yeah, for sure. So, when we look at nature and we kind of consider all biodiversity, whether it's a crocodile or a penguin or anything else, it's very easy to imagine and assume that every species plays a very critical role. And in reality, every species plays a role in the ecosystems that they're part of, whether they are eaten by something, or they eat something, or the waste that they deposit in the environment provides a critical nutrient for other species. Or they alter the ecosystem in a way that makes habitat viable and suitable for other species. These are just some examples of the types of ways that species can kind of play important roles in the ecosystem. But in practice, really kind of identifying the exact roles that any species plays, and then measuring and quantifying those roles is very, very difficult. Because there's obviously lots and lots of variables out there in nature, and it's hard to kind of eliminate them all or control them all to pinpoint what's happening. And so for crocodilians, for a very long time, people have always said, oh, well, they're apex predators. Well, apex predators play a very important role, kind of, quote unquote, controlling the populations of many, if not most, other species in the environment that they live in. So for example, if crocodiles are feeding predominantly on fish, well, then that makes less fish available for other species that are eating fish. And then, of course, that makes the nutrients that fish are depositing less available. But then the crocodiles eat the fish, so then they're depositing the nutrients themselves, and all these sorts of things. And in other cases, crocodilians have been thought to be ecosystem engineers. And so if you look at the case of American alligators in the Everglades, for example, they create what's called an alligator hole. So this is like a small pond that the alligators themselves actively dig out and maintain, which during the dry season become the only points of water in that habitat. So basically all the fish, all the turtles, and everything kind of depend on alligator holes. And then other crocodilians dig burrows, which kind of creates a link to a subterranean environment and different thermal conditions and et cetera for other species. And so, what this paper really tried to do was to look across the scientific literature and say, okay, well, we think that crocodilians are playing all of these really important roles in the ecosystems. And therefore, if they disappear from those ecosystems, this might evoke some kind of ecosystem functionality collapse. But is it true? Do we have the quantitative evidence? And what really struck us is that despite the fact that there is a lot of, let's say, secondary evidence or tangential evidence that these species, the crocodilians, play these important roles in ecosystems, there's very little, hardly any, in fact, direct evidence where somebody kind of measured the impact of a crocodilian on the ecosystem in this very specific role. And so that was really eye-opening for me in particular. It's really the first time that I kind of thought about moving from the assumption, okay, of course these species are important in the ecosystem, to really trying to assess whether they are in a very quantitative way. And interestingly, I mean, the pangolin community is going through this process right now as well, where, you know, we imagine that pangolins have a very important role kind of, you know, controlling insect populations. As I mentioned, you know, they feed exclusively on ants and termites, and, you know, ants and termites can be economically important species for people. You know, termites, for example, cause significant wood damage. Ants can invade crops and overwhelm crops and things like that. And so, you know, are pangolins in natural populations and in natural abundance and densities able to control ant and termite populations? We don't actually know. It would be an interesting question to figure out, for example, amongst any other roles that they might play. Pangolins also dig burrows, for example. And so it's a very difficult question to answer, but it's a worthwhile question to answer, because you know, the more we know about these species, the more that we understand their ecological value and their economic value, for example.
Across the world, what are some prominent threats faced by crocodiles as a taxa?
Yeah, so crocodilians globally, like most species, the most predominant threat, of course, is habitat loss. And crocodilians are a bit in a, let's call it a catch-22 situation, where on the one hand, you know, wetlands themselves are not exactly desirable places for people to live. Like, you know, very few people want to go and live in the middle of a swamp where there's, you know, there's mosquitoes and it's difficult to travel and transport. But what a lot of people do want to live, where a lot of people do want to live, is adjacent to a wetland. So you can imagine a really nice lake or a river, or, you know, even the ocean, an estuary, or, you know, a bay or something, where, you know, it's very nice and scenic. It provides people ample opportunities for recreation or subsistence through fishing. And these are all habitats that are occupied by crocodiles. And so the more that people occupy these same habitats, or the more that people, you know, let's say drain a wetland and convert it into a sugarcane or palm oil plantations, for example, you know, the more that we lose habitats for crocodilians. And crocodilians, of course, have been a very critical group of species for people in terms of meat consumption and other product use. And so, you know, there's virtually no place in the world where crocodilians and people are found together where people do not eat crocodilians. You know, the meat is actually quite desirable, and there's a very significant both local and international meat trade. And then, of course, you know, crocodilians form a very core part of the luxury fashion industry. Crocodilian leather is really capable of being converted and turned into high value luxury fashion commodities, like, you know, purses and wallets and belts and stuff. And you know, that threat in particular was quite a big threat when that trade relied exclusively on the harvest of wild crocodilians. But we kind of, you know, caught on to that very early. And fortunately, crocodilians have become almost a poster child for what a successful sustainable use program can look like around the world, where now what we're doing is we're harvesting crocodilians sustainably and intelligently in a way that doesn't impact the wild populations, except for, you know, let's say minimally impacts them negatively, but most of the impact is actually a positive impact. And we're able to use the revenues generated from the harvest of those wild crocodilian products to support not just crocodilian management in the wild, but protected areas management, and which impacts lots and lots of other species. And so, you know, it's a bit of an interesting scenario where, you know, you would think that some of the species that are being harvested and traded quite heavily, like American alligators, Nile crocodiles, things like that, might be at risk or might be threatened by this trade. But really, those species that are subject to intensively managed sustainable use programs are the only crocodilians that are actually thriving in the wild today. And the species that have never actually been able to be used sustainably or commercially because, you know, maybe the properties of their skin are not conducive to it, or they live in a part of the world where it's very difficult to implement these management programs, are now the ones that are the most threatened. Also, you know, still by habitat loss and the illegal or unsustainable consumption of their meat.
So, talk about the work you have done on the crocodile species in Western and Central Africa. Which species are these, and what is being done for their conservation?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, personally, I love West and Central Africa as a region. It's exceptionally culturally diverse. It's environmentally diverse. Central Africa, the Congo Basin is, it's the left lung of the world, matching, the Amazon's right lung. And so it's very important in terms of the ecosystems of the world and the ecosystem services offered to people and the biodiversity that's found there. And so I was kind of first attracted to work in Central Africa through an opportunity I had to do some research on birds and study bird communities. But while I was there, because I always had this interest in reptiles and crocodiles, I was able to see dwarf crocodiles in the wild. And more importantly, I was able to see dwarf crocodiles in the bushmeat markets of Equatorial Guinea. And this really kind of clued me into this reality that crocodiles exist in many different planes of the world that are interesting to people. And so when I came back from that trip, I really worked to find an avenue to do research on crocodilians in that part of the world. And what I found out was that there's almost nobody doing anything. And so the entire region was kind of open to exploration, and many unanswered crocodile questions of importance were there. And so, for example, one of the very first questions that I sought to address is, well, are the crocodiles of West and Central Africa the same species as the crocodiles we find in other parts of Africa? And prior to my starting my work, we recognized 3 crocodiles in Africa: the Nile crocodile, the dwarf crocodile, and the slender-snout crocodile. But the distribution of all 3 of those crocodiles, if they're considered one species each, really crosses some major biogeographic barriers on the landscape. So these are features like mountains. So, for example, the Mount Cameroon Highlands, or the Ruwenzori Mountains, the Albertine Rift, for example, that crocodiles really just can't cross and can't do gene flow across. And so there should have been no expectation that we're just dealing with 3 crocodile species. And so, in fact, my work has shown that there are now 7. We now recognize 7 crocodile species in Africa, which is really, well, I think it's really cool to be part of research teams and leading research teams that have discovered new species, especially new species that have been so predominant and so kind of quote unquote well studied as crocodilians. But it also has really significant implications for our conservation and management of those species. And so, for example, the Nile crocodile, which is now largely restricted to East and Southern Africa, is doing quite well. Its populations have reduced for sure, but places where it's used sustainably, those sustainable use programs are going quite well, and the numbers can be quite abundant, especially in many protected areas throughout its distribution. Whereas the West African crocodile, which is, call it the sister species to the Nile crocodile, but found almost exclusively in West and Central Africa, is doing much more poorly. It's still the most abundant crocodilian species in that region, but the habitat loss is extensive. Its relationships with people is a lot more complex. And so, for example, one of the things that ends up saving this species in some cases is that people have a very let's say a godlike or a deifying relationship with West African crocodiles. And so in many places it's venerated, and there are sacred sites set aside for its protection by the communities voluntarily. That's what they have decided to do, which is really quite interesting. But if we take the case of the slender-snouted crocodile, for example, we also split this into 2 species. There's one endemic to West Africa, so from Nigeria westwards, and one endemic to Central Africa, so basically Cameroon through the Congos and barely into Lake Tanganyika, for example. The one in Central Africa, while it is declining because of things like the pressure put on its populations through conflict with artisanal fisheries and hunting and habitat loss, it is significantly more abundant, especially in a place like Gabon, which has thousands and thousands and thousands of this species, compared to the West African species, which we estimate throughout its entire range, there's less than 500 adults left in the wild. And these adults are distributed in very patchy populations. So like there's a decent population in Tai National Park in Cote d'Ivoire. It's probably the best population we know so far. But even there, we're estimating less than 100 adults in the entire national park, and that might be generous. The next nearest population is an entirely unprotected area in Western Ghana, where it exists in community lands. And the only reason this crocodile still exists in those lands is because every community that lives adjacent to this river, it's called the Tanoe River, considers the Tanoe River itself to be a sacred river. So that means they don't hunt from it, they don't fish from it, etc. But that doesn't prevent them from degrading the landscape around it. So oftentimes the vegetation along the riverside is cleared very extensively to make room for plantations and agriculture, and then that pollutes the river. There's actual pollution, plastic and paper waste and all that stuff going into the river. And so one of my colleagues, Emmanuel Amoa, and his team in Ghana with Thrust Coal are working on creating the very first community-based protected area in the entire continent of Africa for this crocodile in the Tanoe River, so that the people can do more sustainable practices to kind of actually ensure the sustainability of the river that they find so sacred and the species that it contains. And so it's been quite a journey. In addition to understanding the species, we're doing some ecology work, and putting transmitters on animals to understand their relationships with the environment, doing surveys to assess their population abundance, so that we can better direct conservation actions to where they're most needed and to decide the best interventions that'll work for them, which might include, for example, a captive breeding program, which we have in partnership with the Ivorian government in Abidjan. The National Zoo there has a big population of slender-sided crocodiles. We're breeding those animals to put back into the wild, and that's moving slowly, but we now have a bunch of animals that can go, and it's drawing a lot of attention to the needs of the species.
What have been some of the most pressing challenges you have faced throughout your conservation career?
Oh, that is a very wide open and loaded question in many ways. I think it's I think some of the low hanging fruit, obvious challenges are, funding and sustainable funding. It's the funding landscape for conservation has really evolved over the 20 or 25 years that I've been involved in this field. And, it's becoming increasingly donor driven instead of field driven. And so, the US government, the European Union, and big foundations, things like that are really deciding conservation priorities, which oftentimes align with what's needed on the ground, but don't always, and that's become a challenge. Because the requirements that donors have for financial management are increasing in their rigor, which on the one hand is required because misappropriation and misuse of funds is a real challenge, but on the other hand, that creates a very large barrier to grassroots organizations such as local NGOs working like in country. It makes it very difficult for them to access oftentimes funding pools that they really need to do critical conservation work. There's lots of issues surrounding that is a big challenge. One of the things that is actually very near and dear to my heart, which I find to be very challenging, both technically, scientifically, and even morally and personally, is the infighting that we see in conservation, especially between different groups of professionals who feel differently about the use of wildlife as a resource and a commodity. I think that nobody in the world, even people that support sustainable use of wildlife, want to see wildlife mistreated and subjected to poor welfare conditions. And in a perfect world, people wouldn't need or want to use wildlife, but the reality is much of the world's population still depends on natural resources, direct raw natural resources harvested from nature, including wild species. And so this conflict that has arisen between the so-called animal welfare, animal rights camp and the sustainable use or the evidence-based camp of wildlife managers is really challenging. I mean, ostensibly, all of these people, the only thing they care about is the future of wildlife and the sustainability of the environment. But the more time we spend fighting and arguing with each other, and the less time we spend coming up with viable conservation solutions and really kind of, let's say, quote unquote, fighting the enemy, who are the people that are the groups of stakeholders that are using wildlife unsustainably or causing massive environmental degradation through unsustainable palm oil initiatives or dams and mines and urban development, things that really degrade habitat for all intents and purposes, and unsustainable forestry, like the less likely we are to succeed. And so I find that to be a very big challenge. But on the flip side, I would say that there are more and more opportunities for people around the world to get involved in conservation. There are many, many, many more, NGOs or other organizations and institutions that are working in conservation, especially grassroots and local NGOs. And so that's providing a lot of opportunities for people around the world to get involved. Because of the environmental education initiatives that have been started over the past even 40 years or so, there are more and more people today in very biodiverse, critical parts of the world who just grow up having an interest in the environment and an ethic concerning environmental protection. And so I think that is wonderful. Like the momentum that's coming about for the environment as an important, global issue is unmistakable. And even though the world, generally there's lots of questions as to whether, the global governments are taking things like climate change and habitat loss seriously. objectively they're taking it more seriously now than they ever have been. And so I think that is a really great thing. And so, it's there's challenges and there's opportunities, and we just kind of have to all find our niche and do our best to advance the cause.
And what have been some of your most memorable moments from your career so far?
Oh, the most memorable moments. It's kind of funny. Some of them have to do with, let's say, being in a place and finding a species that we didn't think was there, that we never knew was there. And so, I remember very distinctly, this is, 16, 17 years ago, I was doing some crocodile surveys in the Gambia, which is a very small country in far Western Africa. And, we had some early evidence from the 90s. The crocodiles, especially dwarf and slender-snouted crocodiles, had more or less eradicated from that country. And then all of a sudden, we went out on the river one night and we found both species in one very highly localized place in one night. And so this feeling of like rediscovery of and providing hope for a species in a place that you thought it was lost is it's very indescribable, and of course, being in the lab and getting back some of my genetics results that would show definitively that, we're not just dealing with 3 crocodile species in Africa, but 7. I mean, that's kind of, the dream of many biological scientists to discover a species or resurrect a species. And so those are very kind of memorable moments. But, for me, I think one of the things that I've learned over the years, and fortunately I learned this lesson very early, is that conservation is really less about understanding wildlife and understanding wildlife biology or species, and more about understanding people and understanding how do we work with people to implement the appropriate science and management measures needed to conserve wildlife. And so a lot of my career has been spent developing the capacity and encouraging young scientists in particular West and Central Africa, but all over the world, to really pursue their dream and of working with animals or working with wildlife and working with conservation, and providing them the tools that they need to be able to do that. So, training them, mentoring them through academic degrees, helping them secure funding, advise on their projects, and watching them succeed is probably by far the most rewarding thing that I do today.
So that was the final question I had for you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Anish. It's been really wonderful talking to you, and it's exciting to be able to contribute to your podcast and reach a broader audience. And if anybody listening to this is doing work on pangolins but is not yet in touch with the Pangolin Specialist Group, we highly encourage you to reach out to me or to the PSG. There's our contact information is on the website, and introduce yourselves so that we can figure out how to integrate you into the community and support your critical work. Same thing for crocodiles. We're here for you, and we'd love to get to know you.